Good evening, everybody, and welcome. For those of you who are not familiar with the Taub Center, let me dedicate a minute to tell you about who we are. My name is Avi Weiss. I'm the president of the Taub Center. The Taub Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel is one of Israel's leading social policy think tanks. We conduct and disseminate unbiased, data-driven research on the most pressing social and economic issues facing Israel today. Our research influences Israel's policymakers, legislators, and the public, and helps them inform policy decisions. It also helps philanthropists identify the most pressing needs so that they can direct their social investments accordingly. In order to maintain our independence and our trusted reputation across the political spectrum and by the general public, the Center does not accept any kind of government funding, and we are supported by individuals, foundations, and federations from Israel and from around the world. I want to thank all of our supporters who are here with us tonight. As usual, we'll be publishing our annual State of the Nation report in December, and this year will include, unfortunately, a special chapter on the effects of the war. As always, it will be available on our website, and it will be in print in both English and in Hebrew. Taub researchers have played and will continue to play an essential role in analyzing the socioeconomic issues that are surfacing during this time of emergency and will be affecting our society for years to come. Since the war broke out, we have been involved in analyzing the effects of the war in the different fields we study: education, early childhood, demography, health, welfare, labor markets, macroeconomics, and the environment. Today, we will be addressing the topic of the impact of the war on preschool children. My colleague, Professor Yossi Shavit, will be introducing the speakers for tonight's discussion. Yossi is a professor emeritus of sociology at Tel Aviv University, and he is the Principal Research and Early Childhood Development and Inequality Initiative Chair at the Taub Center. This is an initiative that is supported by the generous donations of the Bracha Foundation, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, and Yad HaNadiv. Over to you, Yossi.
Thank you, Avi. Hello, everyone. Today is the world's Children's Day. I wish we could have celebrated under happier circumstances, but the Taub Center commemorates this important day with a webinar, and this year's webinar will look at the consequences, the effects of the war. Thank you all for attending. Before we get to substance, allow me to briefly tell you about the Center's initiative on early childhood that Avi mentioned. We founded the initiative about 5 years ago to enhance the understanding of socioeconomic factors that affect inequalities in early childhood and in utero, even before birth. Our basic premise is that human development is largely shaped by the circumstances in which children are raised very early in life, and we do research on the roles of several environmental factors that shape these life course outcomes, especially education. One of our main contributions is the creation, in partnership with the Central Bureau of Statistics, of a very large database on all children born in Israel since the 80s, and we have been following them in administrative data sets ever since. In partnership with the Ministry of Health and the KI Institute, we also analyzed data obtained from mother and child, that is Tipat Chalav clinics, and monitor change over time and over age, that is across years and across ages, in various indicators of child development and inequalities therein. We partner with the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, Yad HaNadiv, and Bracha Foundations. These foundations are key players in the Israeli community of experts and activists working on child development, and we are fortunate to benefit from their expertise, guidance, and financial support. Thank you. There are 5 of us in the initiative. Dr. Yael Navon is a sociologist and an expert in the analysis of large data sets. Dr. Carmel Blanc, also a sociologist, is a lecturer at the Rupin Academic College and combines empirical research with social activism and policy development. Dana Shai is a PhD candidate at Tel Aviv University, where she studies stress-related sociological factors such as poverty and belligerence, that affect child development. And finally, Sarit Silverman has a PhD in education from the Hebrew University and specializes in cognitive development. As for me, as Avi noted, I'm a professor emeritus of sociology at Tel Aviv University, where I study processes of social inequality and mobility. I'm also, and maybe that's more important than anything else, a grandfather of 4 young children, all in the age brackets that we study, and maybe that's the reason that I do. Today's webinar will be delivered by Yael, Dana, and Sarit. Yael will share with you a bit of data on the distribution of children exposed to war-related stress throughout the country. Dana will review the literature on the relationship between war, stress, stimulation, and child development. And Sarit will talk about factors of affecting the resilience of children and families in times of stress. So, Yael, please.
Hi. So I'm talking to you this evening from my home in Tel Aviv. An hour after a siren was heard, and I ran with my 5-year-old. When I live here with my partner and my 2 children, 9 and 5 years old, which since the beginning of the war, they got used to sirens, and unfortunately, they have to learn some not so age-appropriate terms such as hostages. As you probably all know, on October 7th, more than 1,200 people, mostly civilians, were killed. And 250 were kidnapped by Hamas. Among those were babies, young children, their siblings, parents, grandparents, teachers, and friends. Thousands of children woke up that morning to unexpected sirens, and many of them, those in towns close to the Gaza border, had to hide in silence for long hours in a safe room, while outside there was gunfire and terrorists. Since October 7th, more than 300,000 reserve soldiers were drafted. Among them, of course, fathers of young children and other relatives. Thousands of rockets were fired, mostly from Gaza, but also from Lebanon. And as we all know, I believe Israel is a small country, so the range of these rockets covered wide areas of the country. My 5-year-old, Yair, live in the center of Israel, as I said, in Tel Aviv, and none of his relatives were injured. His parents are not drafted. And for more than 3 weeks now, his preschool is open 5 days a week, almost as in normal routine. He's a lucky Israeli 5-year-old. But he still shakes every time he hears a siren or explosion, saying, "Mommy, it's okay for me to shake." He looks for buildings to hide in where we are outside, like happened today. And yesterday he put on headphones to hear music and went into the room we call safe, in case there will be a siren and he won't hear. And still, his experience is almost non-disturbing in comparison to that of tens of thousands of other young Israeli children. In the next slide, you will see an example of the map. Here you can see the map and safety guidelines published on the Home Front Command webpage. You can see 3 defense level zones, marked by orange, yellow, and green. The map changes every day after a military assessment of the situation. The colors represent different guidelines. Within them, of course, a restriction on educational activity, including early childhood education and care. So with regard to educational activities, green means no restriction. Yellow permit restricted activities only in places from which standard protected space can be reached within the time available. And orange means educational activities are prohibited. Here you can see the number of young children up to age 5 by the color of their place of residence based on guidelines for October 31st. This is 3.5 weeks into the war. As I said, classification changes often by military assessments, but the numbers shown here represent very closely the situation throughout October. Regardless of this classification, the entire education system, including for young children, was shut down completely during the first week of the war. After this first week, early childhood education and care started to operate gradually in the green and in the yellow areas. Still, we must understand that not all nurseries and kindergartens could operate by the restriction of yellow guidelines, as many do not have standard protected spaces. So some, mainly privately operated, but not only, had to look for an alternative space. Of course, staff shortage was also worse at this time of war. So many young children routine did not turn back to normal for several weeks. Altogether, you can see in this chart that about 2/3 of the young children of Israel were still not regularly back to full education and care routine at least 3 weeks into the war. Lack of routine for long periods is harmful for young children, even without war going on outside and without the parental stress accompanying the situation. On top of this, most of the children in the orange zone, the 42,000 you can see here in the orange zone, as well as thousands of children in yellow areas, were evacuated from their homes. These children, who are more than 4% of young Israeli children, are still displaced 7 weeks after, even today. Here you can see the distribution of young children by the average number of sirens heard in their place of residence in the first 3.5 weeks of the war. Sirens, if you haven't heard them, are very loud and sudden. Following a siren, there are 15 seconds to 3 minutes to find a shelter. In most areas, the time frame is about 60 to 90 seconds. So it can be scary and stressful and can raise stress hormones levels and heartbeats, even for adults. I think we can agree at this point that there are some unusual stressful circumstances that disrupt the normal life routine of a great share of Israeli young children. And it is not a passing event, but is prolonged. We can presume that a lot of resources will be needed to help them and their families overcome the effects. The orange bar here in this chart deserves special attention. It includes the kids who were witnessing the horrors of the first day and are now dislocated. And it did not change for more than 6 weeks now, so almost 7 weeks. You can see that among these children living in orange localities, 1/3 live in low socioeconomic status towns, the white part of the graph of the bar. And another half live in medium-low clusters. These lower socioeconomic municipalities will be the ones that will have to deal with the effect of the war on their young children. And of course, they will need the government assistance. Another sad outcome of the war is that many children are experiencing death in their family. Without expecting the horrific events of October, of course, during the last year, we conducted a study on the educational outcomes of children who experience a death in the nuclear family during early childhood. This study was inspired by the death of Carmel's daughter, Danielle, at the age of only 5.5. We found that children who experienced the death of a family member during early childhood were less likely than their peers to receive matriculation certification in high school. And there was no difference in outcome between the effect of the death of a parent or a sibling. This finding proposed some example of the way in which stressful events in early childhood are related to later outcomes. Dana will talk more about this relationship. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Yael, and hello, everyone. My name is Dana. And first, I would like to share with you that my grandma, my aunt, and my cousins live in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, right on the border with Gaza. And on October 7th, the IDF got them out of the shelter after 18 long hours. Their house was shot, but luckily they are fine. But many of their friends and neighbors were killed or kidnapped to Gaza, and they have been evicted from their home for 45 days now. So these days are clearly stressful for many families and children in Israel. And so now I will briefly talk about the effects of stress on the development of young children. Early childhood is a very critical period for brain and cognitive development. By the age of 5, the brain reaches about 90% of its final size, and most of the brain and nervous system development occurs in the first 1,000 days of life. And if the baby is not exposed to certain stimuli at these ages, it will probably be difficult to catch up later. So the very first years of life are the most formative stage in human development that is greatly influenced by the environment in which the baby grows up in. So it has been claimed that investing in early childhood is economically very rewarding for both individuals and for society as a whole. This is because the brain plasticity is very high in the first years of life. And so the environmental influences of one's neurological development are high the earlier you go in the life course. And the amount of effort that is then required to correct for damages caused early on is huge. And so the environmental enrichment and cognitive stimulation improves children's development. In early childhood, brain development is influenced by the stimulation received from the surroundings. Simple activities such as playing, reading, and singing with children are core components of early childhood stimulation. And these stimulations can improve young children's ability to think, to communicate, and connect with others. And studies find that increasing the stimulation at home during early childhood lead to long-term gains in cognition, academic achievements, employment, and mental health. And an early childhood surrounded by positive relationships, books, and educational toys will eventually leave positive fingerprints on a person's brain well into their adulthood. But fortunately, children are also exposed to negative stimuli. Healthy development can be derailed by excessive or prolonged activation of stress response systems in the body and the brain. And when we are threatened, our bodies prepare us to respond by increasing our heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones. But stress can also be positive, like the first day in kindergarten or getting a vaccine, for example. And learning how to cope with adversity is an important part of healthy child development. But again, unfortunately, children may experience particularly stressful events, such as the loss of a loved one, like Yael said before, or a natural disaster or neglect. When a young child's stress response system are activated within an environment of supportive relationship with adults, these physiological effects are buffered and brought back down to baseline. So the result is a development of a healthy stress response system. However, if the stress response is extreme and long-lasting and buffering relationships are unavailable to the child, the result can be damaged brain structure with lifelong consequences. Such toxic stress can have damaging effects on learning, behavior, and health across the lifespan. And so toxic response to stress can also be caused by exposure to war, like the current war going on in Israel. And many children are experiencing strong or prolonged adversity these days, like hearing sirens, running to shelters, hearing explosions. and unfortunately also seeing people being injured or killed. So beyond all this, children also experience a disruption in their daily routine, such as the closing of educational frameworks and evacuation from their home. And on the other hand, their parents are also experiencing very high and continuous stress these days, which may make it difficult for them to mediate the events for the young children. So this kind of prolonged activation of the stress response system can disrupt the development of the brain and increase the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment well into adulthood. So, And so studies find that exposure to war even during pregnancy have significant effects on the lives of children. For example, this study found a relationship between infant birth rate and exposure to war during the Second Lebanon War in Israel. Women who were pregnant in the third trimester during the war were more likely than women in the first and second trimester to give birth to a lower weight infant. And stress of other kinds can also harm children's life outcomes. For example, exposure to a massive earthquake among pregnant women negatively affected the educational achievements of children at age 7, especially among uneducated mothers, meaning that the chance of recovering from stress damage is lower among children from low socioeconomic strata. And finally, of course, stress resulting from war is also related to children's mental health. A study found that young children from the city of Sderot, near the border with Gaza, suffer more from PTSD, anxiety, and ADHD symptoms in their later childhood compared to children of the same age from central Israel. So given these findings, we can assume that young children across Israel are at risk for post-traumatic stress and other psychological disorders in view of the current war. So, and now Sarit will talk about risk and resilience, and thank you for listening.
Hi, thank you, Dana. Hi, my name is Sarit. I moved to Israel from New Jersey about 17 years ago. I live in Jerusalem with my husband and 3 kids who are 11, 8, and 3 years old. I still have family in the States and know the Jewish community there has also been going through a difficult time in the aftermath of October 7th and the rise of anti-Semitism that has impacted probably many of you listening as well. To summarize what we've heard so far from Yael and Dana, the majority of Israeli children have been exposed to some form of trauma, and prolonged exposure to trauma and stress can have long-term negative impacts on child development and life course outcomes. And at the same time, it's important to remember that despite the risk factors associated with exposure to stress and trauma, not every child exposed to these triggers results in maladaptive functioning. Many children are in fact resilient. If we go back to the previous slide for a moment, we see the rates of psychological disorders are significantly higher in steroid compared to the control group. And they are worryingly high. I do not mean for a moment to diminish the risks, yet a large portion of the children do not develop psychopathology. It's important now more than ever to understand what factors contribute to resilience in the face of adversity. And we are still in the eye of the crisis and can think of ways to bolster children. So hopefully when we do arrive at the day after the war, children can continue to thrive. There are many definitions of resilience. A simple dictionary definition would be the ability to recover from misfortune. I think Ann Mastin's from the University of Minnesota is the most applicable here because it is scalable. She defines resilience as the capacity of a dynamic system to withstand or recover from significant challenges that threaten its stability, viability, or development. So a system can refer to an individual child, or it can be on a larger scale to a municipality's education system, a country's economy, or globally if examining global phenomena such as climate change. And this definition is also useful when formulating policies as it can be applied across disciplines and levels of influence. There are different pathways of adaptation in the face of adversity. Here we see in this graph, if we imagine line B as an individual person going about their life, when they are faced with a difficult event or acute trauma, there's a slight decrease in their level of functioning. And then after the passing of time, they return to their previous level of functioning. But there are multiple possible responses when people are faced with trauma. Some people can remain relatively well functioning in the face of trauma and disaster, as we've seen in line A in the stress resistance pathway. But other people are driven or motivated by adversity, and it kind of fuels them in a phenomena called post-traumatic growth. And there are people, as discussed earlier, whose functioning can suffer long-term after trauma is illustrated in the red line. So the important question, I think, here is what factors can influence these different pathways? There are many different risk and protective factors that can influence children's functioning in the face of war and trauma. I'll briefly discuss a few of them, but this is not an exhaustive list. And I've loosely categorized them into child-focused factors, family, communal, social factors, and circumstantial or contextual factors. But again, this is a loose categorization and by no means exhaustive. Some individual child characteristics that can serve as protective factors include good social skills, high self-esteem, willingness to ask for help, which of course is reliant on the second category of having reliable adults to ask for help. And other child-focused factors include good problem-solving skills and executive functions. In addition, child's age could serve as a risk or protective factors. In some ways, younger children are protected from stress from war because they cannot fully cognitively process what is happening, as opposed to older children who can comprehend and be more frightened or anxious as a result. But also children demonstrate stress in different ways. Younger children can display stress symptoms and more behaviorally than typical anxiety symptoms seen in adults and children, such as regressions in achieved behaviors. Some circumstantial or contextual factors that can influence resilience and functioning. An important factor is level of exposure, right? We've discussed children across Israel have been exposed in some way to trauma, but the level of exposure runs the gamut. Children who experienced violence in their own homes, in their own towns, versus children who have heard sirens, but in the end of the day are safe and their homes are intact and safe. So children who've been more exposed to more acts of violence are more likely to develop psychopathology and PTSD. Another important factor is separation from parents. Research on resilience in children after the Australian bushfire in 1983 or the Buffalo Creek Dam disaster in 1972 found children who remained with their parents throughout the disaster fared much better than other children who were separated from their parents. Another important circumstantial factor is disruption of routine, which Yael mentioned. Disruption of routine in and of itself can be very detrimental, as we saw during the pandemic. School closures negatively impacted children's mental health. In the aftermath of trauma, disruption of routine can compound the stress and anxiety associated with the trauma because it disrupts the comfort of the daily routine and can serve as a constant reminder of the trauma. The most important protective factor, I think, is relationships, whether it's parents, families, peers, schools, community. Those can really serve as an important source of comfort and protective factors for children. Parents can really mediate disaster for children. So the parents' level of adjustment in the face of trauma is extremely important of how their children will experience the trauma. Family functioning, the functioning of schools and community and participation in extracurricular activities and youth groups are extremely important to promote resilience. I know that when schools reopened here in Jerusalem in October, a few weeks after the war started, I really debated about whether or not I wanted to send my children back to school once I knew that schools were really making sure to increase security. And even though my instinct was to keep them at home, I did choose to send them because I did know on the intellectual level that going back to school and returning to routine and continuing the relationships with their peers and teachers can be a really important protective factor. And none of these factors in any of these categories are isolated. They're all interconnected and dynamically related. The resilience of a child can depend on the resilience of their family, and the resilience of the family is highly influenced by the resources surrounding the community surrounding their family. Family socioeconomic status can play an important role in how families fare during trauma and crisis. Poorer families tend to have less resources to be able to bounce back and have the resilience factors. And while higher socioeconomic status families have greater access to resources and support systems, and in many ways, access also to mental health services. To bring it all together, Israel is unique compared to other countries in that it has a large proportion of young children, and many of those children have been exposed to trauma and loss, not just now, but since the creation of the state. And it's important to discuss what policies can encourage resilience in children in the face of the current crisis. So as we discussed many times today, the importance of a daily routine. Of course, it's important to ensure safety for all frameworks and places, but it's important for children of all ages, even for adults, to establish a new daily routine as an important protective factor. This also applies to the school system to try to retain a normal routine as a protective factor. Schools should also add social emotional skill building as part of the core curriculum. For younger children in daycare centers and preschools, that's building relationships and the importance of attachment figures as the caregivers and the preschool teachers and for younger children. And lastly, I'd like to borrow a concept from public health of proportionate universalism, which is the idea that providing a service to everyone, but proportionate to their needs. So generally that's been used for equity and how to provide services equitably across different groups. And as I mentioned earlier, families from higher socioeconomic status have more tools to handle crisis, but this also can be applied to how can we provide support to all children across Israel, and almost every child has been impacted by the war in different ways, and how to bolster their mental health and to design interventions that can reach all children, but that are unique to their own individual and community's needs. Thank you very much for listening. I'll pass it back to Avi.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yael. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Sarit, for very, very interesting discussions. We're open now for questions. Please put your question in chat, and I'll be happy to convey it. Let me start with a question that Nir wrote. Nir Kedar has asked, the young children of Israel had to deal with the effects of COVID and the war in a very short time. This is an unprecedented situation in the history of the country. What adjustments should be made in social services in order to help those children? Yossi, do you want to answer this?
Well, clearly, this is a double jeopardy. These the same cohorts were hit twice by external shocks, which are clearly detrimental to what one would call normal child development. And these shocks in combination, I'm sure, will erode human capital in Israel in the years to come. We've seen in that study on death in the family, the damage that is caused to educational attainment by atrocities. And it's likely that these cohorts will suffer in this regard unless huge amounts of resources are investment in an attempt to help them recuperate. I think the system must take this into account. School days must be extended. Counseling services must be put in place in much larger volumes than done before. And this, as Sarit said, this is now the whole country. It's not just the Otef, not just the settlements along the Gaza border. The expense will be huge, but I don't see that we have a choice. We have to heal, and healing will cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yossi. Dina is asking, is there any research that shows that children who grow up with siblings tend to have more resiliency during such difficult times? Feel free, anybody who wants to chip in.
I don't know of a specific study that has examined the effects of siblings, but in general, any social relationships are an important protective factor, but whether siblings specifically, I am not familiar with.
That might be interesting. Follow-up study on the previous study that you guys just finished. Very interesting question. Shefa asks, what is being done for trauma-informed early childhood education? Do you understand the question? She's asking about, in the education, inform them about trauma, how to deal with it, what it is, what it means. Trauma informed, that should be hyphenated, early childhood education.
Maybe somebody in the audience feels qualified to answer.
I'll be happy to answer. Hey, everyone. So we, Branko Weiss already started working about models of education informed trauma from the age of since birth until the age of 18. And I hopefully will have the first model by the end of 4 months. But that's exactly what we're doing now, and it's very interesting. It actually it will be actually at need that everyone at every educational college in Israel, or anyone who learns education, will have to learn trauma-informed education, because we believe that this is one of the things in Israel we'll have to deal with in the next 10 years or so.
Right. So that actually goes to Shefa's other question, which was how are teachers prepared to deal with children who have been traumatized? So that's basically the same issue. Thank you very much for that input. Joel Walters, I think this is Joel Walters, who I know very well. I hope so. Are there data being collected about trauma and resilience in particularly vulnerable communities? For instance, in asylum seekers in South Tel Aviv and in Bedouin communities.
Dana may want to answer this question, not about Tel Aviv, but about the Otef.
About collecting data?
Are there any data being collected about trauma and about resilience in specific communities?
There's not collecting data on this war, the current war, since the October summers, but we have data about previous events, previous wars in Israel, like the Second Lebanon War, and we have information about Tzuk Eitan, and this data exists. So this is actually my PhD research. So hopefully in the 2 years, about 2 years, we'll probably could say something about this data set.
Thank you, Dana. Daniela asks, to what extent has the government sufficiently been able to respond to the needs of preschool children during this emergency?
I will say first that, well, it did not, because as I said, preschools are not protected. Not all preschools or nurseries are protected. So this is the first thing that I think we should notice, because if we had a protected place in every kindergarten, we could help the children continue with the routine. This is the first thing I think is important to note.
Absolutely true.
Sarit, anything else?
Yeah, I wanted to just also add from my experiences that there was a lot of chaos when preschools and schools were reopening. There were a lot of unclear questions about security, where security would be coming from. Is that the responsibility of the municipality? Is the responsibility of the school itself? Is it a national? It was very unclear who was in charge of increasing security for the educational institutions. A lot of educators didn't return to work. Some people left the country. Some people had spouses who were drafted and didn't want to go back to work, or had different circumstances. People who've moved, people who've been displaced. There was a lot of variability and uncertainty, and it's been a very hard time in a systems level, an education system. I think now it's been about a month that we've been in the new normal, and things seem to have, at least in schools that have been open for a month, it seems to be a new normal. But in the beginning, it was very unclear.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's really normal yet. It's I think that we've got a long way to go before we get back to normal.
A very long time until normal.
Yeah, and just think about the children who had to leave their homes that are no longer there, and how you solve the problems with respect to what classes you put them into, what you do with respect to having enough teachers. Do you separate them into existing classes? Do you try to create their own classes? These are all very, very difficult questions to answer. Michal has asked, I know there is always an issue with shortage of preschool teachers and staff. What is the situation now, and is it being looked at as an area that should gain more governmental investment? The answer to the last part, Michal, is we always need more investment in everything. But let's get to the actual question. Hi, Carmel.
Hi. So actually, we did a poll in the Taub Center in February, at the beginning of the year. And in the poll, we asked kindergarten staff about their feelings in the system. And we saw that there are very high percentage of staff that wants to leave. And there is a huge shortage in personnel in preschool children daycares. We believe that now the shortage has been increased because some of the systems were closed and then open, and sometimes it's not open all the week, and people are looking for a different place to work. We are now planning a new wave of this survey to check whether the feelings have changed, because we believe that right now the personnel that was already stressed and very packed with children, now they have another burden on their shoulders because they need to worry to the children's safety. And when you are 2 or 3 staff members and you have 20 or 30 children that you need to carry sometimes on your hands because they can't run to the shelter, it adds a high amount of stress and burden on their shoulders. So we believe that when the system will open regularly, not all the personnel will come back. So we believe the problem will increase, and it was already a large and huge problem, which the current policy has no answer to that. There was a large reform in daycares, and it took care of some of the shortages of the system, but not the personnel shortage problem.
So then let me ask a follow-up question to that. Carmela, whoever wants to answer that, I'm changing the focus from the children to the parents. Some of the parents who had to move away with their children from the Otef, from the area around Gaza, or from the north, some of those mothers, generally in particular, fewer fathers, are also teachers or are early childhood caretakers. And my question is, have they been in any way absorbed into the system so that they could continue to give the education, continue to give it, perhaps to different classes, perhaps to the children who moved with them? Do you know anything about those people who were moved away? Were they able to blend back in any way? Does anybody know this? I don't know the answer. I'd love to know the answer to that.
I think maybe Noah. Do you know the answer? Because we have no data on this. This is what we want to ask in the survey. We want to ask also people that moved, whether
That's
they
really
continue to work in a different education systems. But usually the children were absorbed in the cities that they went through. So they moved to a different cities, and then they just got in the daycares with the current staff. So
right.
we believe
it depends.
Sorry for interrupting. It's actually not entirely correct.
Right, exactly.
I was dislocated from Sderot with my children. So for our children, they opened מרחבי למידה, special schools for the children, special schools for the children of Sderot. In each of the cities, Tel Aviv, Yam HaMelech, and Eilat, all the teachers that were evacuated from their homes are part of the teaching staff.
Good.
And it's supported by teaching soldiers, מורות חיילות.
Thank you, Toby.
It depends. I'm sorry. It depends, I think, on where in Eilat and the Dead Sea. I'm talking just about the early childhood, of course. So from 3 to 6, the education ministry has or tried to put a kindergarten teacher in every hotel where they opened a kindergarten. It's not, well, it's now it's getting much better, but still it's not the regular kindergarten teacher that they were used to. Don't forget that the staff that gave and that's exactly what we're dealing with now, is that the staff that actually gave them or worked with them is traumatized by himself. Some of them were actually, if they used to work in the Otef, now some of them are in the north or in the center, and some of them are in Eilat. So they're not even close to each other. And one thing that we also noticed is that מדריכות חינוכיות, so with the English?
Teaching soldiers.
No, the מדריכות חינוכיות that שנותנות הדרכה חינוכית.
The mentors of the staff.
Exactly, the supervisors, the mentors that give the staff, help the staff every day. They're also traumatized. So it's very, very difficult, because we actually know that baby can feel what their parents or מבוגר משמעותי feels at a very, very young age. And if they're not, אם הם לא מבוסתות בעצם, אם הצוות לא מבוסת, זה אומר שמאוד מאוד יהיה קשה גם כמובן לבסט את הפעוטות, וכשיש גם הורים לא מבוסתים בערנות יתר בגלל, עוררות יתר בגלל הטראומה, וגם הצוות הוא כזה, אנחנו בעצם ילדים שלא בהכרח היו בסיכון, עכשיו נמצאים בסיכון מתמשך, וכל זה בלי הדרכה. You can translate now. I'm sorry.
Just to try to say in short what you said, I'm sure I can't do it justice, but basically if the staff is in trauma, if the staff is not able to give the type of services, and the children are not going to be able to get what they need in order to be able to overcome this. So I'm sure that's not exactly what you said, but
it's good enough.
Are there any other questions? If there aren't, Elizabeth Raphael has asked, are there online remote homeschooling preschool programs happening in Israel through Zoom or whatever? Is there a picture book list relating to helping with stress or trauma circulating around the schools for teachers, trauma therapists, and parents?
I can say only from my experience that, of course.
Yeah, you're with us.
Okay, sorry.
We can hear you.
Of course, there are Zoom studies, but mostly for school-age children, not for kindergartners. And I'm not sure it's good for kindergartners to interact in Zoom. I mean, mine tried to celebrate the birthday of a friend from the kindergarten in Zoom. It wasn't that successful. So there are no Zoom studies for kindergartners, unless the teacher want to like think it's good for the kids. And another thing that about a booklet, someone asked. So there are some booklets from the Open University for parents. I'm not sure how much the staff of preschools and kindergartens get the instructions or the booklets. And as a parent, I can say that it doesn't feel that the psychological services are on top of things in at least in Tel Aviv, which is a city of a lot of children, and in this war also a lot of sirens and
And also with circulating of book lists or tools for parents and teachers, the consumer would have to want to read them, not the parent would need to have the mental capacity and free space to have the time to read them and have the interest to read them. So there's been many resources circulating from Open University, from Goshen, from Ministry of Education, but the parent has to have to have the time and the motivation to sit and read them, which based on people's different levels of experience may not have that capacity right now.
So you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. If there are no more questions, let me say thank you to the entire early childhood team, to Yael, Dana, Sarit, Carmel, who came in and answered some questions, to Yossi, of course, and to everybody who helped set up this webinar. It's been very interesting. It's been very instructive. And thank you all for participating. And we look forward to seeing you at our next talk in the series.